Hey guys, Jeffrey from Headstrong Training Systems here. So today we're going to look at the sumo deadlift, and in particular we're going to look at one of the main reasons, or one of the reasons why people often experience a soft lockout in their sumo deadlift. And what I mean by soft lockout, when I talk about a soft lockout, I'm talking about a point where you see that at lockout they're unable to drive their knees through or their hips through. You see that right now my knees can be considered soft, my hips can be considered soft, and in order for me to come out of this position, I essentially have to hitch out of that position. So we're going to talk about how we're going to avoid getting into that, being stuck with our soft lockout issue. Now, one of the main reasons why people often experience a soft lockout on their sumo deadlift is because of their starting position. In their starting position, they go into too much hip extension. So what I mean by that is, say, in a lot of people's setup, as they're sitting up down, they try to keep their hips very close to the bar and they try to maintain a very upright torso. Now, that's not a bad thing because you're correct. In your sumo deadlift, you want to obtain a very upright starting position because that's better leverages. However, the problem with that is, if you try to start with your hips very close to, too close to the bar, and you've got your pelvis rotated through, the problem with that is you reduce your moment arm. What I mean by that is you reduce the distance that your hips are able to travel throughout the lift. Now, when doing any movement, when doing any lift, you need a moment arm. You need distance to travel. So what I mean by that is essentially the lockout of the deadlift, the conventional or sumo deadlift, is a hip thrust. So the problem is, if you already perform extension of the hips, if you already start in a position where your hips are driven through, what are you going to do at lockout? You have no room, you have no space, you have no moment arm or displacement to drive the hips through. So with any movement, in order for me to perform the hip thrust for the sumo lockout, I need to start with my hips back. And so that's, in terms of that, that's talking about the horizontal displacement of your hips. Now, let me just briefly touch on the vertical displacement. The other component which needs lockout to be performed is the knees. Now, with the knees, vertical displacement happens. You see that the moment arm of my knees is created by me dropping down. When I drop down, my knees go into flexion, my knees bend, and as a result, that gives my knees room to perform extension, like so. If my knees didn't flex, then there's no way for them to perform extension. Now let's apply that case with the hips. If my hips don't go back, if my hips go straight down and not enough back, then at lockout, I've got nothing to push in my hips. And so as a result, there's a soft lockout. So how do we combat the issue of a soft lockout due to a lack of extension? From your initial setup, you're going to want to push the hips back. Push the hips back, and as a result of you pushing the hips back, then you've got space for your hips to drive through at lockout. So this all comes down to your moment arm and your displacement. In order to create room for a muscle group to perform an action, you have to do the reverse first. So to summarize what we've gone over today, basically one of the main reasons for a soft lockout on your sumo deadlift is because you haven't created room for the hips. You haven't created a moment arm for the hips to drive through to perform that hip thrust. So to combat that soft lockout, instead of trying to wedge your hips in as closely as you can in your starting position, push those hips back a little, just even slightly. Push those hips back, create yourself a moment. Don't overthink your torso angle and all those extra factors. Push your hips back, create movement, create distance for the hips to perform a hip thrust at lockout, and that will, a lot of the times, correct your soft lockout issue due to the hips. So that's all from me today, guys. Hopefully that was helpful for you, and I'll catch you guys next time. Take care.